Sure, but it's better if you understand something as well. That always helps, I think. Anyway, what I want to do is to look at identity and the concept of identity in the writing of early modern news. So early modern means la prima epoca moderna. So we're looking at from 1500 to 1700. Now this is my area of research. And I must say that before, until recently, when I said this was interesting at all, because it's a rather sort of specific area of research. But it has become interesting recently. This whole concept of news and identity and truth, la verità. And so for this, I must thank Donald Trump, yes? Because the whole concept of news and truth and identity has become recently very, very relevant. The whole concept of post-truth, yes, and how it is connected to news. So we have post-truth was named Word of the Year by Oxford Dictionary, quindi la parola più importante dell'anno 2016 for what it represents. Yes? And so, what is post-truth? Objective facts are less influential in shaping, that is, costituire, formare, public opinion than il richiamo to the emotion and personal belief. Now, this has a lot to do with identity, as we shall see. So, what does identity mean? When I talk about identity in the news, what am I saying? Well, to give you an example, let's look at this English tabloid, The Sun. Have you heard of The Sun? Have you seen The Sun? Avete visto pagina 3 di The Sun? Maschi, dite la verità. Have you seen page 3 of The Sun? No? On page 3, no, questo non dovrei dire perché sennò sono accusato subito di non lo dirò. Ma i maschi possono venire da me dopo, poi posso spiegare tutto dopo. Yes? Anyway, The Sun is a tabloid in England, very, very popular, the most popular in the sense of circulation, tiratura, that there is in England. Yes? And until recently, su pagina 3, c'era sempre la foto di una donna topless. E quindi, until recently. This newspaper is owned by who? Who is the owner of this newspaper? Murdoch, exactly. Rupert Murdoch. Yes, he is the owner of Sky. He is the owner of The Sun. He is the owner of the very important quality newspaper in England, The Times. Okay? So he's very important. And he started this newspaper in 1969. And what does he's saying, the editors say in the first number. So here we see linguistic features, aspetti linguistici dell'identità. So this is l'articolo di fondo. Welcome to the new sun. You are going to like it. On page 1 of this newspaper, every day you will see the slogan, "Forward with the people." So, what do we see immediately? We see immediately this direct relationship with the reader. You. I know you, I am writing for you. I have identified you. There's this relationship expressed by the personal pronoun you. It is not, if I continue, it is not original, but we make no apologies for it, because that is what we believe in. That is the way ahead. And so, here, the giornalista, is identifying himself or herself. C'è questo riferimento a se stesso. We. Yes? And so we have you and we have we. There is this clear identification. We will never forget your place in the sun. It will be produced for you. Okay? So, this is a kind of language which is very similar to the language of spoken English. In spoken English, there is a dialogue between me and you. And this is a kind of dialogue which is and social ideology. How through this very direct kind of language is it possible to influence politics and social understanding? And one of the conclusions that they reached is that this simple kind of language can help to consolidare political opinion, social opinion. Because what the writer is doing is expressing a political concept, a social concept, in the language of everyday English, nel linguaggio dell'inglese di ogni giorno. È un linguaggio molto semplice, molto diretto. Yes? And so, attraverso this very direct, simple language, it is possible to underline, sottolineare politics and social concepts, which, in a way, che da un certo punto di vista, vengono presi per scontato. Il linguaggio è semplice, il linguaggio è diretto, quello che contiene, allora sembra naturale, sembra ovvio. And so it is an interesting kind of political language expressed through this newspaper. This newspaper is very, very right-wing. È un tabloid, le persone che le comprano sono spesso working class, working class, do you understand working class? Yes? Ma è di destra, molto di destra. Io sono un po' preoccupato per Brexit in questo momento, ma io spero che questi giornali mantengano una certa responsabilità, perché se no le cose potrebbero diventare abbastanza difficili. E dal titolo di questo giornale di oggi vedo già che non c'è nessuna responsabilità. Vi dico alla fine cosa hanno scritto oggi. So, that is identity in the modern press. Now, let's go back in time.
let's go back to the early modern period. So we're going back to the 1500. News. Now, news became very, very important. People, nel Rinascimento, they wanted to know what was happening around them. Ordinary people wanted to know. Merchants wanted to know. Politicians wanted to know. News became fundamental. How is news transmitted? It is transmitted through spoken language, official proclamations, word of mouth, or written language, manoscritto or a stampa. So, if we look at written language, news was communicated in letters to friends and family. There was commercial news. There was diplomatic correspondence. Allora, se tu avevi delle informazioni che riguardavano la tua comunità, tu avevi una specie di obbligo sociale a comunicare queste informazioni al tuo giro di amicizie, alle persone importanti nella comunità in cui vivevi. News was very, very important. And so, yes, news was in the form of print and, in Italy, in the form of avvisi. Look at this one here. This is an English pamphlet, un opuscolo, del 1614. Good news from Florence of a famous victory obtained against the Turks. All right, so you have this news in Europe that was traveling around Europe. News, when we understand it then, was had a European dimension. People were very interested not only in the news in their own country, but what was happening elsewhere in Europe. Very important. And so it says here, this news from Florence, come sono arrivati in Inghilterra, translated faithfully into English, out of French, e quindi queste notizie sono state prima tradotte in francese e poi da francese in inglese. But I'm going to look at now what is called diplomatic correspondence. Because much of the news that we find in print, a forma di stampa, in fact was news that had reached one particular place from a diplomat in another place. Okay? And so the diplomatic corrispondenza, la corrispondenza diplomatica, was very, very important. And these diplomats erano ambasciatori, o allora in italiano erano chiamati agenti, and they wrote once a week to their Secretary of State. All right, well, so if we want to know about news then, and if we want to know about the role of identity, let's have a look at this diplomatic correspondence. And in fact, there were two very important Tuscan diplomats who lived and worked in London in the 17th century. And one was Amerigo Savetti, whose real name was Alessandro Antelminelli. Yeah? He went to London because he was involved in a conspiracy, una congiura in Lucca. And he had to leave Tuscany because it had become very dangerous for him. And then the other one was Francesco Terriesi. Now, I have studied this correspondence at the Archivio di Stato in Florence. Has anyone been to the Archivio di Stato? It's interesting, isn't it? All'Archivio di Stato c'è il Mediceo Principato, c'è tutta la corrispondenza che è arrivata a Firenze, alla corte medicea, durante il Principato. E ci sono tutti questi filze, una filza, è grande così, in cui sono raccolte le lettere che riguardavano un certo momento storico, un certo argomento che aveva a che fare con la corte medicea in quell'epoca. It's fascinating. Why did you go to the archive? Lei come mai è andata all'archivio?
Perché ho fatto la scuola lavoro.
Ah sì? Ah bene, è interessante, vero? Sì? E quindi voi quando se doveste mai fare una ricerca che riguarda il controllo di manoscritti, ve lo dico, può essere una cosa molto molto interessante. So, these ambassadors, questi agenti, scrivevano ai loro segretari di Stato una volta alla settimana e, per esempio qui, this is a photocopy of one of the letters. This is from a medical Salvietti. Now, what kind of information did they give in these letters? Did they talk about their identity? How is identity expressed? Is it expressed at all? Because remember, this is the information that often then went into the newspapers. Well, these the diplomats, they wrote 2 manoscritti. For each week ci sono 2 manoscritti. In one of these, they wrote to the secretary what they had done during the week. They had to show to the Secretary of State that they were doing what the Secretary of State wanted them to do in London. They had instructions, they had to follow these instructions. But then, in the other document, in the other manuscritto, they wrote in a very, very impersonal way the information that had been collected that week. So in one of these manuscritti, one of these documents, there is a summary of what he had done. In another one, there is a very factual, well, yes, okay, well, there is a factual information. Okay? So let's just look a moment at the manuscript where the diplomat gives information about what he has done. And this is quite interesting. This is not the kind of information which is found in the newspapers, which is passed to the newspapers, but it's interesting because it tells us something about relations between Italians and Italian diplomats and the English and English diplomats at that time. So, let's read this. Questo è pezzo qui è preso da una lettera di terrorese, la gente a Londra, che ha scritto il 13 gennaio 1690 al suo segretario di Stato. And he's talking about the English. So, do you want to read it?
Okay. Con tale arrivo mi ha tornato a fare una domanda il signor Neville, che mi aveva fatto di già più volte, cioè che Sua Altezza Serenissima m'aveva con essa mandato una cassetta di galanterie che Sua Altezza gli ha fatto sperare per una sua nipote. Gli inglesi sono come i bambini, dalli quali conviene guardarsi di promettere cosa alcuna, perché mai se le scordano, né vi lasciano vivere, sino a tanto che non se li è data.
Okay, fine. Yes. So here we have this ambassador, yes, this envoy, who's complaining to his Secretary of State about the English. He is saying, in fact, that, the English, you can't promise them anything because what you promise, they take very, very literally. Prendono alla lettera questi impegni, queste promesse. C'è questa differenza culturale che lui sta mettendo in evidenza, almeno secondo lui c'è questa cosa. This is interesting, in fact. Is it still true? If it was true then, why? Why did the English, as he says here, take these promises, these commitments, questi impegni, so seriously? Well, I was thinking about this, in fact, and when I thought about it, I thought about this. Yes. Well, what do words mean? Do words have meaning? Yes, you have the Italian ambassador who says, ma come mai se le prendono così alla lettera, queste promesse? So perhaps, this is just an idea, in the 17th century, words had, for the English, a special power. There was something important in the idea of words. And thinking about that, I thought about this reference in the Bible. Yes. Io sono protestante, da ragazzo dovevamo studiare la Bibbia, e così, e quindi ancora mi ricordo qualcosa. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All right? The Protestants, they studied the Bible very, very carefully. The words in the Bible were not metaphors, non avevano una funzione metaforica. They were understood literally. Words had meaning. Words were powerful. And so perhaps, as words had this meaning in the Bible, and you studied the Bible very, very carefully, then words generally had meaning. And so if promises were made, if commitments were given, forse questo spiega un po' come mai erano presi così alla lettera. All right, now before we look at the other kind of news, let's just have one more example of cultural differences which appear in this diplomatic correspondence. And this is here we have an English envoy who was living in Florence, and he is writing to his ambassador, or to his Secretary of State in London. And he is talking about the way in which we write letters in Italy and the way in which we write letters in England. And he had recently written a letter to the Grand Duke of Tuscany. And so there was illustrissimo, serenissimo, tutto questo linguaggio, tutti questi titoli di cortesia. And he had to translate this for his English Secretary of State. And the English Secretary of State said, ma no, questo è impossibile, ma tutti questi forme di cortesia, ma cioè stiamo parlando di un Granduca, niente di più. And so he has to justify himself. And he says to his Secretary of State, the other ceremonial expressions to be translated verbatim into English may very well be interpreted high compliments. Forse possono sembrare esagerati tutti questi titoli di cortesia. But in the Italian language are only flourishes, non hanno molto significato, which carry no consequence with them. Which the Italians, tutti questi titoli di cortesia, call doing business with soft words and hard arguments. And so he is saying that in Italy, when working with Italians, you have to use a different kind of language to what is used in England when you're working with the English. In Italy, you argue hard, okay, naturale, but within these soft words. And this, I think, is still a big difference between the way in which argumentation is carried out in an Anglo-Saxon context and the way it is carried out in an Italian context. The Anglo-Saxons, very direct. You get to the point immediately. You do not worry about courtesy so much. In Italy, I think even now, yes, it is regarded as an important prerequisite, un prerequisito importante. Forse a livello di argomentazione non ha nessuna importanza, ma ha importanza a livello di forma. And so this is important, I think. Anyway, let's now look at the other letters which carried the news. These were factual. There is no indication of the news writer's identity. Questi sono I famosi avvisi, dove si mettono in evidenza le informazioni. Io non sono io a dare un'interpretazione di queste informazioni. Le informazioni sono queste. There is a dateline, e come questo qui. This is an example. So here we have the news, which is reported in the diplomatic correspondence, and then was often communicated also in the newspapers and avvisi. Vai.
Si ebbe qui martedì passato l'avviso per la via di Francia del sanguinoso conflitto seguito a Livorno fra i vasselli inglesi e quelli degli olandesi e come, ritrovandosi questi in maggior numero, avessero affondato e abbregiato agli inglesi 4 dei loro miglior vasselli di guerra che avessero in quelle parti e ammazzato buon numero dei loro marinai.
Okay. So here, there is no relationship between me and you. I am not talking to you, the reader. I am not expressing my identity. in this kind of news, which was the news that was very often found in Europe, in England, in the early modern period, nella prima epoca moderna, identity is not there. Not in the general avvisi, not in the general newspapers. Okay. This kind of news, as I said, yes, was circulated, si trasmetteva per l'Europa. There is a Venetian newsletter, un avviso veneziano che ho esaminato all'Archivio di Stato. And it says here, di Venezia, il 3 luglio 1621, sabato notte, in questo porto, cioè è scritto così, e quindi non sono tutti rifusi miei. Andati alcuni con una piotta armati alla nave nominata Toro Negro, che carica di diverse ricche merci stabili di partenza per Constantinople. And then we find in an English newspaper, yes, later in the month, from Venice, the 6th of July, 1621. On Saturday at night, certain men with ships well appointed set upon the ship called the Toro Negro that lay richly laden to sail to Constantinople. So, we find in the English newspaper a translation, more or less exact. Ci sono delle differenze, ma ovviamente la fonte di questa notizia inglese è quella veneziana. And this is the kind of news that was circulated at that time. No identity. Right? So, let's just see then. What advantages? I want you for 2 minutes to think about this. What advantages are there if you are a news writer, if you are a publisher of news at that time? What advantages are there in giving news where there is no identity? Think about that a moment. You are a news writer, perché c'erano allora una specie di professione, erano scrittori di avvisi, erano news writers. Why would it be better to write news where there is no identity, where you are not communicating directly to the reader through the use of you, where you are not expressing your identity, where you have found this information, often from diplomatic correspondence, which has been given to you or sold to you, anche venduto spesso da parte del diplomatico. What advantage? Why? Okay, do you have an idea?
Perhaps you can reach more people.
Yes. Perhaps you can reach more people. And I think that's a good idea. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Why? Yeah.
Can I say why?
Yeah.
Okay. Because maybe if I'm the writer and I follow a certain, like I'm right or left,
Mm-hmm.
then the reader instantly says, oh, I'm from the left wing, I'm not going to read you that you are of the right wing.
I think that's important. Yes, because when we think about news, we must always think about the commercial aspect. News was very important, and people soon understood there was money to be made out of news. Some countries, there was news which was organized, controlled by the state. But in other countries, like in England, not all the time, but in the 17th century, news was commercial. People wrote newspapers and published newspapers to make money, okay? And so this commercial aspect is important in news and in many kinds of other forms of text production. Always remember this. Yes, text, communication takes place in a context. There is a context. And in this context, often the commercial aspect is very important. So, what she says is absolutely right. Yes. If you want to have a wide audience, the best thing to do is to write news where you are giving information. You are not putting your own political orientation onto the news. You are giving the information, and then the Catholic can interpret the news in one way and the Protestant in another way, because obviously in the early modern period we can't talk about left or right, but we can certainly talk about Protestant and Catholic. The big dichotomy, la dichotomia, which was important then, was the religious difference. So that's one very good argument. Good. Any others? Stiamo andando bene. Remember, in the early modern period, being a journalist could be dangerous. Like being a journalist nowadays can be dangerous in some parts of the world, in some parts not far from here, perhaps. All right? Yes. So, what you want to do then is to show that you are giving the news. You are a provider of news. You are not an interpreter of news. Being a journalist, then, a news writer, could be dangerous. There was always the risk that you could be accused by the authorities of giving wrong information, in the sense of a wrong interpretation of the news. So, in order to avoid that kind of accusation, questo specie di accusa, what you say is that I am not interpreting the news, I am giving you the news. This is the information, this is the facts. So then we can say that the news writers, they did not express their identity in the sense that they did not want to give the impression they were interpreting the news. In the news then, we find a lot of information about what, where, who, when. We do not find information about why. Why is generally not given. Yeah? And so the why is understood by the reader. The reader must arrive at the why. too many R's in this. The reader must arrive at the why. Okay? Avete capito? And this is very different from the news that we read nowadays. We buy the Repubblica, we buy the giornali. Yes? There is a very clear editorial program. È chiaro. And so we are reading this, and we are not always, we're not really trying to find the explanation for an event, because the newspaper gives the explanation for the event. You see? Then it was different. And this meant that the understanding of news was very different. People would read the news in this very factual way, and then in groups they would discuss the news. So when we say that the early modern period was a very oral culture, una cultura impostata sull'aspetto orale. Does that make sense in Italian? Yes? People talked a lot. They discussed a lot. And a lot of what they discussed was the news that they had read and trying to understand it, because they did not get much help from the news writers of the day. And so the actual understanding of news, the reading, was very different from today. Then there were not many publications. You, the person living at that time, you did not have access, c'erano poche possibilità di leggere qualcosa di stampato, di scritto. Pochissime possibilità. Now, we are completely drowned. You know, drowned, affogati, by news, by texts, by written texts. What we do nowadays when we read is we read very, very quickly. Very, very quickly. We are not reading all the text. We are reading just to get some information. Then the reading practices were different. They read the newspaper from the first word to the last word. Reading was a very different practice from the way it is now. And so they would read the information and then they would discuss it. And so I can imagine that they had a very good idea of what was in the news. Perhaps a better idea of what was in the news than what we have, because they read it very closely. So, let's have a look at this. Fra 10 minuti più o meno faccio altre domande a voi e si conclude. So, what advantages are there in impersonal news presentation? So, news writer as provider, not maker of news. And what advantages are there for both news writer and news reader? Well, it's less dangerous at a personal level. I don't interpret the news. I don't even make it. I provide it. That's all. Don't send me to prison. It's less risky commercially, as she said here. You don't know your readership. Yes, this can be bought by a Catholic, by a Protestant. Chi lo sa? Another thing, is that news was very important. People wanted to have news. But at the same time, not everybody believed that the news that they read was reliable. Reliable means affidabile. È vero quello che sto leggendo? È possibile che sia così? Therefore, what the news publisher does, and the news writer does, is to use a kind of structure, una struttura, che è simile a un'altra struttura di argomentazione che ha molto prestigio. And so the writing of news was similar to the writing of history. History had prestige. News did not have prestige. People wanted it, but they did not have much faith always in what they read, because there were some kinds of news publications which were obviously untrue. C'erano tutte queste ballate che parlavano dei mostri, dei draghi, di queste parti mostruose dove persone, donne pativano 5 cani e 4 gatti. And so some of the news was obviously fantastic, but impossible. And so this obviously wrong news contaminated some of the other kinds of news. So, you wrote your news like history. Again, no identity. Like history, in a sense, è una cronaca. A cronaca, si dice cronaca? È una cronaca. What does that mean? It means that in history, in the writing of history, you explain history from the earliest date, dal tempo più lontano, e pian piano porti la conoscenza del lettore a un momento più recente. All right? So, the news stories were like this. The writer here is talking about the news on the 4th, poi si arriva al 5th, poi the next morning, the 6th, and then this afternoon. It's like history. Here we have a chronological reporting of news, un racconto, resoconto chronological from the latest, nel momento più lontano, fino a oggi. Is that what news is like nowadays? Is it the same style? Rhetorical question. È una domanda retorica. Is it the same style? No, it isn't. All right. So let's look at this. Here, the writer is just telling news in the form of history. Nowadays, here we have a news report. You know Rod Stewart? Certo che non lo conoscete. Voi, nessuno lo conosce. No, va bene, meglio per voi. Va bene. Rod Stewart. Luciano? Ah, meno Luciano, ecco, sì, va bene. Era a rock and roll star, a rocker, yes, of the anni 70-80. Bene. Read this. Ora, leggete voi questo e ditemi se anche qui c'è questo resoconto cronologico di questo evento. All right? You've got 3 minutes. Ci avete 3 minuti per leggerlo. Sono stati a Portofino, tutti gli inglesi vengono in Italia, compreso il mio principe. Vero? Prince Charles, vero? L'amore, Portofino, Florence, vero? Porta Fortuna. Is this a chronological report? No, it is not. If it was chronological, like it was in the 16th, 17th century, 18th century, it would begin. Stuart married Lancaster, a photographer, in 2007. They have been together for 10 years. She discovered she was pregnant in Portofino. It's not chronological. Why not? Because nowadays, journalists, they decide what is important in the story. They give immediate focus, mettono a fuoco quello che è importante in the story. And what is important is that Rod Stewart is going to become a father again. And so the journalist now decides what is important, and often what is important is also the most recent information, the most recent news. And so we say that the journalist, the newspaper, gives an angle, fa una messa a fuoco su cosa è importante. All right? So this is in itself an interpretation. Through this, the journalist is expressing his or her identity, in a sense that the journalist is saying, this is what is important, this is the key, la chiave, for reading this particular news. This did not happen before, not usually, all right? And so here we can see that in fact this news report is interesting from a temporal point of view, da un punto di vista temporale, nel senso che ci sono flash forwards and flash backwards. Si va avanti e indietro con il tempo. So, Rod Stewart will become a father again, diventerà futuro. The singer who is married to Penny Lancaster already has a 4-year-old son, presente. Sentence 4, Lancaster discovered she was pregnant in Portofino, passato. And so there is this juxtaposizione, cioè questo cambio di, what do you say, di impostazione temporale. Okay, so very different from what it was before. In fact, we say that nowadays, the news article, the news report, is like an inverted pyramid. questo qui, si vede che era il mio tentativo di fare un inverted pyramid, che non mi è riuscito, ma alla fine ci è rinunciato. Ma va bene, voi sapete cos'è un inverted pyramid? Va bene, a pyramid è così, no? An inverted pyramid è girato, il contrario, alla rovescia. What this means is that the information in your news article at the beginning is very general, and then it becomes more and more specific. General, the important part of the news, and then more and more specific. When we think of communication, we must always think, as I said, about a possible commercial aspect and also about professional practice. Professional practice. Why is this inverted pyramid structure useful in the world of news? Just think a moment about this. Why should this inverted pyramid structure be useful in the world of news? What's the advantage of it? Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, the big advantage is that, yes, is that you are the news publisher, well, the news editor. E sulla pagina 3, mettiamo questo articolo su pagina 3. Va bene, quindi il giornalista, quante parole devo scrivere? 500 parole. Ok, lei scrive 500 parole. Then, su pagina 3, arriva un'altra informazione importante e quindi non c'è più spazio per 500 parole, magari soltanto 300 parole. But with this inverted pyramid, that does not cause a problem, because what you, the editor, do, yes, is to eliminare le ultime 200 parole. E quindi, niente di male. The important information is at the beginning, it becomes more and more specific. Il lettore non avrà più le informazioni più dettagliate, ma non cambia a livello di impostazione sulla pagina, no, non crea problemi a livello di impostazione della pagina. You understand? So, it's useful. Ora, 2 minuti e poi possiamo parlare insieme. But there were exceptions. I said that the writer did not usually want to give an interpretation to the news. But there are exceptions. One exception is in the English Civil War, nella guerra civile inglese, dal 1642 al 1648. Then you wanted to give an interpretation. You wanted your readers to understand the news. Per forza, cioè loro devono capire cosa stanno facendo di male questi maledetti soldati del re o viceversa. And so in that kind of news, where there is conflict, where there is controversy, you, the news writer, are primarily influenced by giving a political message. And in this political message, you must be hoping that what you say is very clearly understood. E quindi in quel caso lì ci sono quello che possiamo chiamare headlines, prototypical headlines, che sarebbero titoli di giornale a livello prototipico. Sì? Cioè i primi titoli di giornale che mettono proprio in evidenza All right? The lesson is now concluding, and... Oh, yeah, thank you. Good, bene, okay. C'è qualcuno che ha l'applausometro? Era buono, ma era meglio all'inizio? Non si sa. Vabbè, può essere buono anche alla fine. No. Finalmente ha finito.
Nick,
Sì.
you didn't tell us the title of the last issue of the Sun.
Ah, ok.
Sì, sì.
All right, now. Voi sapete che questa famosa lettera che è stata consegnata dal governo inglese è stata consegnata la settimana scorsa, in cui abbiamo, cioè la May, il primo ministro, ha indicato l'intenzione della Gran Bretagna di lasciare l'Unione Europea. E poi, un giorno dopo, 2 giorni dopo, l'Unione Europea aveva comunicato i punti chiave delle sue proposte. Cosa pensa di dover discutere in questo negoziato di lungo 2 anni? E in una di queste proposte c'era il riferimento, che è stato caldamente appoggiato dalla Spagna, di rimettere in discussione la sovranità della Gran Bretagna della Gibraltar. Sapete dove c'è la Gibraltar? Sì, certo. Allora, la Gibraltar cos'è in sostanza? In sostanza è una roccia, ok? Ma è una roccia importante perché, cioè a parte il fatto che c'ha questa posizione strategica importante, cioè proprio nel Mediterraneo, è molto molto importante nella cultura, nella impostazione culturale e mentale degli inglesi. Fa parte del nostro ex impero, va bene? È ancora lì. Rinunciare alla Gibraltar sarebbe come rinunciare al nostro passato, al nostro presente, al nostro futuro. Sembra ridicolo, è così. Mia moglie è italiana, è fiorentina. Da quando c'è stato il voto del referendum, lei mi guarda malissimo. Io le dico, ma io avrei votato, sì, no, non ci credi, ma dico cosa devo fare? Si arrabbia sempre di più, dicendomi, ma questa cosa della Gibraltar, chi se ne frega della Gibraltar? Anyway, it's very, very important. E 2 giorni fa, un ex leader del Partito Conservatore ha detto che se gli spagnoli pensano di rimettere in discussione la sorte della Gibraltar, forse dovrebbero ricordarsi cosa è successo quando un altro paese, sempre di lingua spagnola, latina, ha provato a mettere in discussione la sovranità di un territorio inglese. E quindi a che cosa sta facendo riferimento? Falklands, ok? E quindi questo è già il livello, e quindi siamo soltanto nel 3° giorno di questo negoziato. Va bene, e io dicevo, va bene, speriamo era una così, una mossa politica diplomatica per far capire, speriamo che i tabloid non riprendano tutto questo discorso, che dimostrano una certa responsabilità. Invece ho visto oggi il titolo del Sun, questo famoso Sun, è scritto, ora lo scrivo qui, Up yours, signors. Scusi. All right. Up yours, signors. Now, this is very colloquial e non è per nulla fine. Ecco, diciamo così, per nulla fine. Now, signors is a rather derogatory, abbastanza, not derogatorio, what do you say? Sprezzante, riferimento sprezzante agli spagnoli, signors, okay? It rhymes with this, up yours. Up yours, oh Dio, cosa, la posso dire o no? Lo dico, va bene, ma cioè non arrabbiatevi dopo. Up yours is a very colloquial expression, I will say it in English, yes. Yeah, because it's better, which means fuck off. Yeah? So, this is the level of newspaper coverage, newspaper argument in this newspaper. E siamo soltanto nella prima settimana e quindi se continua così ci saranno problemi. Avete delle domande? Anche tutte e due. Proviamo uno, vediamo come va.
No, tutti e due perché c'è lo streaming.
Ah, okay, sorry.
No, regarding to what we said before about us nowadays being completely drawn by information,
Yeah.
could we say that perhaps those little lucky people who could read were maybe better informed and knew how to keep information, and whereas those who didn't have information were more passionate to look for it, to search?
Yes, yeah, exactly, that's right. No, you're right. Bene, allora, what can we say? Do I need that? O ne ho bisogno? Ah no, io posso fare così. Ah, okay, yes. So, having news then, as I have said, was very important. It was important because it gave you social status. If you had news, that meant that you were an important person. You were, in inglese si dice in the loop, al corrente. It was very, very important. Referring to the diplomatic correspondence, you often read these diplomats asking very strongly their secretaries of state to send them the news about Italy, about Tuscany, because their social status, their ability to work well in London depended upon how they were regarded by the London community in relation to Tuscany, in relation to the Grand Duke. And this relationship was most clearly indicated by their ability to indicate they had news from the particular country for whom they worked. Without this news, yes, they were like everybody else. Yeah? There was no difference between them. And so those people who had news, yes, were considered important. And as I said, it was considered important as a social obligation, come obbligo sociale, to give the news to other people. Then, the other people, when they got the news, yes, we can imagine that they discussed it and discussed the meaning of it. The famous Jürgen Habermas, yes, the communication sociologist, has indicated that the concept of public sphere, do you understand this? La sfera pubblica. La sfera pubblica involves rational discussion, yes, regarding events of the day. And he says that in England, this rational discussion regarding events of the day began in the 17th century, when this kind of news was given, and where there is no interpretation given to the news. And so, as a result, you are discussing the significance of it with other people. I don't know if nowadays this is the case. My impression is that in the reception of news, the reception of news is a much more private event, a private practice. There is little discussion of it. Yes, you read your particular newspaper, you watch your particular news program, and it more or less confirms what you instinctively believe, but you do not discuss it. This is my impression. And so perhaps the importance of news then also is based on how it is received, yes, and how it therefore is organized socially afterwards. Ecco. Ah.
Professor, thank you very much for your speech.
Okay, thank you.
Which was very beautiful. Since I was feeling like I was immersed in the world of very, very beautiful English speech, which really I had privilege here only on the BBC, for example, or some English media. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, since you are a top-notch expert in the media, I used the English expression top-notch. Does it seem to you that the language which is employed by the English government and the European government, both in Brussels and London, is haughty naughty? I mean, I also use the English expression haughty naughty, yes?
Naughty.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is the language haughty naughty? Is it not? Does it seem to you it's not any more diplomatic language, but haughty naughty language? A language which is used on the streets. I mean.
Oh, I see. Demotic. Yeah. Yeah.
Language
Yeah.
about the Gibraltar, about the possible hard Brexit, which is perceived like a hard divorce between the two parties. Well, that is like the first question. And the second one is, do you feel the threat in the post-truth reality, which is now described by the leading English and American newspapers as the end of democracy? And I'm not joking, I mean, every single day, if we look at The Guardian, there is at least one article where the anchor, the writer, the journalist is very much, well, I wouldn't say anxious, but very much worried about the future of democracy, because the post-truth reality is somehow replacing the media, and the media are replaced in the social networks. I mean, it's another reality. It's another world. You were talking about the media, but now we find ourselves in another world of social networks. Is it a threat in your mind? Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much for the compliments too. And I was a bit worried. I mean, often, after the compliments, you get some accusation, you get some criticism. But this time, good. Thank you very much. So, regarding the first question, there's the kind of language which is used, by the British government and by the European Union. Well, I can really sort of speak more about the British government and how. I mean, what they have to do is to try and convince the readers that they are negotiating well, that they have the right objectives. And so when doing this, as you say, they're having to use the language of the people. They want to convince the people that they are doing the right thing. So they are using specifically that kind of language. And it is not, as I said, just the government, but also the press, la stampa, which is using that kind of language. Not all the press, but some of the press. And obviously enough, you have some exaggerations like that there. Then, regarding the other question, what I appreciate about the early modern readers of news is that they did have this skepticism, erano un po' scettici regarding the news, the reliability of the news. This I don't find nowadays. I think that most people, when they read the news, they do not usually think, well, perhaps this is wrong. Could it be wrong? And so there is that fundamental difference, and a difference which becomes more serious if those people who are reading the news and do not question the news are reading news which is post-truth, which contains information where the news writer is not worried about the reliability of that particular information. And so, yes, I think that there are definite problems regarding this. It's difficult to know exactly how it will manifest itself, come dovrebbe manifestarsi a livello pratico, ma certainly there are problems.